This week, the church gives us a somewhat shorter gospel than the gospels that we've heard the last few weeks, but it is one that is packed with power and meaning. But I guess that could be said about all the passages that we read and hear from the sacred gospel. So this one is no exception to the rule. The background for this, the setup, is given to us right at the very beginning of the gospel story. The Pharisees are interested in trying to entrap Jesus. And so they go and they form an unlikely alliance with this group called the Herodians. Now that may not mean a lot to us if we didn't know that in the Holy Land of Jesus' day at this particular time, the Pharisees, of course, were the representatives of the religious teachers of the law of Moses. So they were the recognized religious authorities. But then there were these Herodians, which were members of a political party at the time that were interested in seeing the reign of King Herod, who was, of course, that sort of fall king, propped up by the Romans as a sort of puppet king to do their bidding in the Holy Land of this time. And so the Herodians and the Pharisees would have hated each other. I mean, one was religious, one was political, and they came from very different means. The Herodians wanted the Roman occupation to be successful because they stand to benefit from that. The Pharisees, on the other hand, would want to have nothing to do with that, since it was so antithetical to the law of Moses. And so these two groups formed this unlikely alliance with the sole purpose of trying to trap Jesus in his speech. And so they very disingenuously proposed this question to him after first trying to butter him up, with all of this. We know that you are a truthful man. You teach the way of God. You're not concerned with anyone's opinion, and you don't care about people's status, that sort of thing. So, right, Jesus should feel very confident that they're coming to him in all sincerity and truth. Not. So he sees right through that immediately and says, you hypocrites. He knows what their intention is. Because if he answers their question with a simple yes, it is lawful to pay the census tax, that is going to upset the religious authorities and all the religious people of Israel who resented this Roman occupation, this Roman imposition of Roman law. But if he answered in the other direction and said, then he would alienate the other group of people. So it was one of those things that a simple yes or no would get Jesus in trouble either way. Notice how he responds, knowing their hypocrisy, knowing their deceitfulness, looking at the coin that bears Caesar's image and his inscription on it. He says, repay to Caesar what belongs to Caesar, and to God what belongs to God. So he answers their question by not answering their question, at least not the way they expected. So let's look at the two parts of that command, because those words are addressed to us just as surely as they were addressed to the original audience of Jesus' hearers. Repay to Caesar what belongs to Caesar. That is a clear and unambiguous call to responsible citizenship. We have to acknowledge that we are members of society. In every age, we belong to a particular society, a culture, a country, a state, a city, and we are called to be responsible citizens of that reality in which we live. But here's a little bit of a twist for us. We are called to live our citizenship responsibly, but to live it as American Catholics, not as Catholic Americans. Notice which word is substantive, Catholic, and which word is the adjectival modifier, American. Fundamentally, first and foremost, we are members of the Catholic Church. We profess the Catholic faith. And so in our exercise of being responsible citizens, we are called to bring to bear the light of the gospel, the truth of gospel values, and the teaching of our church in everything that we do, every way in which we interact with one another. And so, yes, we're called to be responsible citizens, to vote when it's time to vote, but to vote as informed voters, with our minds clearly informed about the issues that are of greatest importance and enlightened by the teaching of Christ and his church. We bring the gospel to bear on those kinds of decisions. We are called to pay taxes. Not that any of us particularly enjoys doing that, but that's part of our civic responsibility, to financially support the society in which we live. We're called also to obey the laws and to advocate for obedience to the laws of society, the laws of the land, insofar as they are not in opposition to the law of God. That's an important qualifier for us Catholics. When we find laws of society that are in opposition to the law of God, then our duty as Catholic believers, Catholic members of society, is to work toward having those laws changed, reformed, overturned, whatever it might be. If today were not Sunday, today, October 22nd, we would be celebrating the memorial of Pope St. John Paul II. And he was a pope who had a very keen awareness of the interplay between our responsibility as citizens in society, in the world, and our duties and responsibilities as Catholics. And he always encouraged, throughout his long pontificate, he encouraged us to actively engage the culture and the society around us, but to do so from the position of our Catholic faith, to make sure that the leaven of the gospel, the light of the gospel, is brought to bear in all the situations and all the dialogues, all the conversations that take place about what we should and shouldn't do as a society. We can also look to the example of St. Thomas More, whom I'm sure many of you know the story of him. He was a very well-known scholar and lawyer in England at the time of King Henry VIII. He served as the Chancellor of England for a number of years until he refused to sign the oath of allegiance that recognized King Henry's declaration that he was the head of the church in England. Remember, that was the big dust-up between Henry VIII and the Pope at the time, because the Pope refused to annul his marriage to Catherine of Aragon. And so Henry decided to set out on his own course and expected all the nobles and all the clergy of England to follow him, and most of them did, unfortunately. Sir Thomas More, though, stood up, and he refused to sign that oath of allegiance to the king that would recognize the king as the supreme head of the church. He said that's not the way Jesus intended it. And he gave his life. And the final words before he went to his execution were, "I die the king's good servant, but God's first." I die the king's good servant, but God's first. Sir Thomas More never forgot that he was first and foremost a Catholic. Then he was an Englishman. Then he was many other things. But first and foremost, a person of Catholic faith. And that brings us, when we talk about being God's good servant first, it brings us to the second part of today's injunction from Jesus, his admonition, that we are to repay to God what belongs to God. And that is a clear and certain call to responsible stewardship.